All right, it is September 5th, and we are here for the Georgetown ISD Board Workshop. On our agenda for today, we have STAR 3 through 8 data review. We're going to be briefly discussing Senate Bill 763 and the 23-24 proposed tax rate. At this time, do we have any public comment? We have no public comment registered. So we are going to, it would not be great if I didn't mention that today is Miss Blank's birthday. So happy birthday. She happens to be wearing a button. That
somebody gave me.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Wes Vanacek, who's going to be leading us through the STAR 3 through 8 data review with Terry Conrad as well.
All right, thank you, sir. So just a couple of thoughts before we go into the information. We'll kind of share some charts and graphs and then pause and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions and share thoughts or wonders. As always, please feel free to interrupt us as we go and ask questions as they come up. And then the next thing is, this is not necessarily new information, just some new looks that we haven't presented to you yet, but it's the information that we've shared with you previously in the weekly updates. All right, so this first chart is looking at kind of the largest zoomed out perspective of student performance in GISD as it pertains to STAR and EOC. So this does include 3 through 8 STAR, but it also includes the EOC results that we went over this summer. So this is looking at the largest bucket of tests and what is the percentage of those tests that were at the passing mark or above. The bars on the chart, obviously the COVID bar, that's the year 2020. So there was not a STAR test administered that year, so that's what that represents. And then the green bar just kind of represents the change to the STAR test itself. So between 2022 and 2023, we did see an overall net improvement of tests that were in the passing rate or above. So this includes the approaches, meets, and masters. Take another look at similar, but this breaks it out now by the approaches, meets, and masters. All the way back to 2019, so on the far left, the blue column is our 2019. Green is the most recent of this spring. So we see that 72% that we just saw on the slide before, but now teased out as the meets and the masters above. So seeing performance kind of creep back and surpass the 2019 pre-pandemic times. Masters is kind of holding steady right at the 15% level. All right, we're going to take a quick look at the demographic profile. So we're going to take a look, just like we did this summer, at how different demographic groups performed. But before we do that, just want to take a look at the demographic profile of GISD based on how we built the charts. I think it's important to share this information just to show how dynamic and diverse our community is and how our school district is, and what that requires from us is a tailored response across the district as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. So just so you guys kind of have that frame of reference as we're looking at it as well. A few important pieces to note here is that 2 in every 5 students in GISD is economically disadvantaged. 1 in every 5 is an emergent bilingual student. And 1 in every 5 is also receiving special education services. So we do know that with recent legislation, the numbers of students served in special education services are on the rise. The inclusion of dyslexia, and also just the change of the rules as to what allows a student to be identified as special education. All right, so jumping in, looking at STAR grades 3 through 5 reading language arts. So this is a bucket of 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade students. On the left of each bar set is the year prior GISD compared to that same year of state performance. So last year is 2022 in the middle of the chart there, 2023 on the far right. And kind of the noticeable changes is mostly at the approaches and the meets level in terms of improvements. Whereas we do see the masters in the dark blue kind of reduce or decline this year. That's a similar trend that we've seen across the state as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about why we think we're seeing this trend, or why the state's also seeing that same trend in reading language arts. You may recall previously we had a writing test in 4th grade and in 7th grade. and those writing scores across the state were generally quite low. This year, as part of the STAR redesign, writing is worked into every reading test, 3rd through 8th grade. So these reading scores now include writing as part of the aggregate score. And Terry will hit on that in a moment. That is something that the commissioner, we were just reviewing, that they're seeing that same kind of, maybe reading scores improved, however the writing scores didn't, and it makes it look like an overall flat line or even decline. This is looking at 6 through 8 reading. Same concept there. We do see some of the same growth in the meets category. That's the orange bar across the middle from last year to this year. It's a trend that we see at the state level as well. But I will call to attention what this look allows us to see is that gap between us and the state. Is that gap shrinking? Is it holding steady? That kind of piece. Obviously, we'd like to see that gap narrow. By all means, feel free to stop me. We've got 2 more slides and we're going to have some takeaways. So this look is a demographic breakout for the same 3 through 5 reading language arts. So on the far left is all students. The darker bar is last year's, and the green bar is 2023. So I guess technically 2022 compared to 2023. This is where we see that similar trend in grades 3 through 5 of either kind of holding steady or a little bit of dip in some areas. And then 6-8, same look by demographic. We do see some improvements here from last year, or from the year prior. Suspect that that writing having a lower impact on the upper grades, just as the student literacy improves or increases throughout their time.
And the green bar is approaches and higher.
That's right. Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that. Yep, that's correct. All right, just a few overall next steps. These kind of apply not only to reading language arts, but also throughout the rest of the content areas that we're going to look at. So just want to tease them out at the beginning and just know they're also going to kind of carry through as takeaways and next steps. I don't believe that any of this is going to be super new, but it bears just kind of calling to mind based on our conversations of our improvement plans over the last couple months. But next steps regarding supporting this work, obviously bolstering the multi-tiered system of support. That work in our organization is vital. Campuses are using this information along with other data points to determine essential intervention standards. What that means, those are the standards in which Tier 2 intervention is being applied to. So when a student is not showing progress on those, teachers are applying an intervention to ensure that they're at the level that they need to be on those standards. Also working on formative assessment strategies, not only the quality and effectiveness, but also working common formatives within teams as well. Super relevant change engine work on the priority objectives. As a reminder, we had our campuses choose one of the priority objectives in goal area 1, which is student learning in progress, to undergo major change on. And so in those change engines, you see work aligned to instruction, assessment, intervention being aligned, monitoring progress towards mastery of the content, meeting standards. And so working that work speaks to the results that we're looking at today as well. Continued professional learning support on curriculum documents. There's a few pieces throughout this area. I know Terry will tease it out. When we're looking at, maybe we saw approaches and meets is going up, but a master's is holding steady. That's an area to look in and look. Do we have the rigor that we need in the curriculum documents and that kind of thing to get to the right depth? More of an exploratory aspect. And then finally, supporting our campuses in their professional learning community support, or PLCs. We use that language. And that's essentially supporting our teams doing the work of understanding the content that they need the students to learn, understanding if they are learning it, and then responding if they are or are not. All right, a few more takeaways from 3 through 8.
So specifically, as we look through the STAR 3 through 8 reading scores, like Wes mentioned, with the STAR redesign, there was a redesign on all of the content areas, but in particular, ELAR seemed to be the most dramatic changes across the state and in GISD. And like Wes mentioned, one of those big things was combining the reading and writing test into one test. We're now testing writing at all levels, and there are some new item types that I'm going to talk about that we need to have some authentic practice around. So one of those was what's called paired selection. So for the most part, our students seem to struggle with paired selections, and these are passages in which a student is given some type of maybe informational text and then a poem. They have to read both and understand both of those. Then they have to be able to compare what the author was trying to state and compare and contrast those two different pieces of text together. So our students seem to have a little bit of a struggle. Those were challenging for our 3 through 5 students in particular. Also, there were these new questions called extended constructed response, which I'm going to show you an example of. And this probably would have been seen much more on the writing test. This was what was part of what was now showing up on the reading test, and so we know we have an area of practice around the extended constructed response. So this here is actually the extended constructed response from the 3rd grade test. So what these ask you to do is read one or more pieces of literature. Then you have to write a well-constructed essay in which you have either a main idea, a thesis statement. And what we saw from analyzing our student data was that our students seem to struggle with supporting their claims with evidence from the reading. So that's one of the things that we'll need to work on more and have authentic experiences with in our curriculum documents. And I'm going to go over kind of some of the big takeaways from our analysis. Obviously, there's much more that we've done and other takeaways, but wanted to give you some of the big points of the things that we saw that were different this year compared to years in the past.
Terry, go back one second.
Yep.
So the little
It's like,
the little remember to,
yeah,
is that on their document?
it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, there's a remember to, and then I actually cut off a part 2 that says, go back and check everything. There's one more part 2 that walks them through the process as well. It says take your time, but also pace your time, because it is timed, and you need to know that. It says all that stuff at the bottom as well, too.
Trustees, I just want to share with you, Wes and Terry done a great job of setting this up, but it is arguably what we're asking 3rd graders to do now in terms of complexity of the prompt is what we were asking 7th graders to do 10 years ago. And so the priority objectives that Wes described of making sure instruction, assessment, and intervention are aligned is probably one of the most important things that principals are responsible for. It's making sure that the level of complexity, not the tested item, we're not into becoming a test prep center, but the complexity of what we're asking kids to do reflects the complexity of the standard and what they'll be asked to perform on at the end of the year.
And the other thing I'd add here too, I've been recently doing quite a bit of reading about trying to boost my knowledge in literacy in the science of how kids learn how to read. And a lot of what it talks about is, in a statement like this, a kid's going to perform better if they have background knowledge about recycling. Well, they're going to learn that background knowledge about recycling more likely in science class than they are in ELAR class. But because of the focus on math and literacy, we have de-emphasized a little bit of our time in science and social studies because we've been, and not we, GISD, the nation has been focusing on math and literacy. And so what tests don't show and what they can't tease out is a kid who has some background on recycling will answer this, whether their reading comprehension is at the same level as another kid or not, they will answer it better if they have background knowledge on recycling. And so you'll see when we get to the science and social studies aspects, we've really got to, we're working to embed literacy into science and social studies as well. And we can't neglect those content areas because we don't know the passage that's going to show up on the reading test, but if they have some background knowledge of that content, they're going to perform better. And so we can't neglect them learning about science, social studies, current events, things like that, so that they have some context that they can draw on when they answer these questions as well. So some next steps in 3rd through 8 ELAR. We actually did look at the data in conjunction with, we've been doing a pilot program about what we've been calling the CAT framework, the Knowledge Acquisition and Transformation Framework. That's the program that we've been working with Texas A&M and partnering with them on. And our schools that implemented that learning with fidelity, showed greater gains in all of the areas in which reading comprehension was required, because this is a reading comprehension framework. So we're excited to see that, and we're going to be continuing our work with the CAT implementation this year in 4th through 8th grade, and want to really thank Kelly Jones and Hilda Diaz and Jen Carney who are spearheading that work. From what we saw about the paired response and extended constructive response, we know we need to embed some authentic learning around that. We don't want this to be, drill and kill test prep of that type of response of how they have to answer on a test, but also they need to be authentically seeing how you're going to read 2 pieces of literature that you might not have any context around, and how you might, what strategies you might use in order to be able to compare and contrast those types of literature, or how you just generally construct a well-defined thesis statement and then support your evidence from text. And these are all things that if they learn it in the writing process, it'll help them in the reading comprehension. If they learn it in reading comprehension when they're looking through text, they'll actually be better at writing it as well. So we're looking at how to embed those authentically into our curriculum documents as well. And then I wanted to mention too, we know that 3 through 8 results don't start with 3rd grade, and that's, honestly, by the point that we're intervening at that point, we're late. So we have a lot of emphasis on our K2 literacy instruction. You all adopted a more systematic phonics instructional resource over the summer, so we've had really good reviews of the start of that for our K2 program. So we're working on more systematic phonics instruction. We're still doing our literacy labs and working with our younger grades on how we bolster our balanced literacy program at K2. I think that's questions.
Kara, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
About the phonics that I
Yes.
don't remember. Could you tell us what the name of that was? Again?
Amplify. So yeah, so Amplify M-Class is the assessment that we're using in an intervention, and so Amplify skills is the phonics piece that we're using. And what is nice about that program as well is it is phonics, but it's 60 minutes, so it's phonics plus some reading language arts that's beyond phonics, but it incorporates the skills that you're learning into a wider set of literacy learning for 60 minutes. And what seems to be good about that program as well is it brings in some science and social studies standards and content, so that you're not learning those things in isolation.
Is it laid out? Is it a curriculum that is laid out systematically? What needs to be taught every day or every week or whatever it is?
Yeah. There's a YAG with it that has the modules. There's a little bit of a pre-assessment at the beginning, so they can put kids where they need to in the app. But it is very much the kids get a workbook that goes along with that unit that has practice that they can take home, and then teacher resources that go along with it as well. And our teachers were trained in that at the beginning of the school year.
Awesome. That's great.
All right, back to you.
All right. Any other questions or anything before we keep rolling? Nope. All right, so now taking a look at STAR grades 3-5 math. So we'll, same concept as previously, just in the mathematics areas now. So looking at the same type of growth in the meets category, not quite as much at the masters, and then kind of holding steady at the approaches. And then 6-8 math, so year on year, from 2022 to 2023, seeing a 7% increase in the overall. Looks like most of that is in the meets and approaches category. And then teasing it out by demographic, this is the demographic look at 3-5 math. Overall showing fair growth. And then looking at 6-8 math.
So let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. It looks to me like we did much better in math than in reading, and that's because the reading test was fundamentally changed, and math is math.
That's absolutely
All right.
correct. Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Much better said than we did, so thank you. Very nicely done.
And that's a trend that's seen beyond Georgetown as well.
So a little bit about our math score analysis. So we were really excited to see that we had an increase in the percentage of students who passed. So that's approaches and meets and masters, but both of those percentages in every single grade in math this year. So that was really exciting for us to see. Again, I want to give a shout out to Amy Dedian and Jody Hoadley and Jen Carney for their work on everything that we've been doing for our math instruction. Most of our grades are at or above our pre-pandemic passing rate, so that's also really exciting to see. Because particularly math saw a greater dip during COVID. Most of the research was saying parents were reading to kids at home but not necessarily doing math workbooks, and so we saw a greater dip during COVID, and so that we've recovered back to that, we're really excited to see. But like Wes mentioned, we're not seeing the growth in masters, and I still have to do a little digging there because some of that for sure is curricular, some of that is also testing practices with our advanced math students that I want to dig in a little more.
And I would just mention, this year was also a standard setting year for cut scores, and so that's the delicate thing of comparing, masters to masters last year and so forth, because the cut scores did change. We've not fully unpacked to see is the masters cut score a little bit different or more rigorous than previously. I know coming into this, we were assured that they were going to maintain those rigor levels. But we've definitely already seen some fluctuation just in those pieces.
So some next steps, and what really we're seeing is we're going to be looking into our curriculum and our instruction to emphasize some of the areas that we know students struggled with on our math exams, but also when we're talking about our MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, using this information to help pick intervention standards. And what we have to look at here is, our third graders that we saw for this data are not the third graders sitting in our room, but they are the fourth graders. So we need to use that data to decide what intervention standards in the following year we need to maybe pay additional attention to. So in particular, our third and fourth grade students seem to struggle with questions that ask them to solve problems off of pictorial models. Actually, as I was looking through some of this, I was seeing terms of picture graphs that you never see beyond third and fourth grade, but it's a strategy they need to learn how to use. Fourth and fifth grade students, they had this type of question where it's a missing piece question where they have to work backwards, and maybe they're given the area and a side, and they have to then figure out the length of a rectangle or things like that. Fifth grade had a new question type, which was called Guess My Number with Clues, and what was tricky about this one is that there could be multiple answers that were right, and so that's just a different type of strategy when testing that for the most part our kids are used to taking tests that have a right answer, or maybe it has like all of the above, but here they had to analyze every single response and see if each one of those could be a correct answer. And then at the middle school level, our lowest area cluster was equations and inequalities. So looking at ways that we can bolster our curriculum and then our intervention standards in those areas. Before I move on, any questions particularly on math?
So when we were probably in March and April, when we were looking at the new STAR test, we all said to ourselves, you cannot make a comparison between the 2022 results and the 2023 results. And I noticed that's what we're looking at that, but we're not, when you look at the state, when you look all the way across the board, although it was said multiple times, you cannot make a comparison, we are making a comparison. So I guess my question is, do you feel, based upon what you see, is there some validity in making that comparison?
I think the one thing when we're talking about comparisons, the comparisons are really hard to do when you're talking about what the state will eventually come out with in terms of school letter grades. The Texas Education Agency themselves said student performance may improve and the rating will go down in many cases. In terms of comparison from year to year and comparison to state, that at least gives us some things to use as a barometer,
Oh,
thermometer?
yeah,
Yeah. Thermometer on how we are performing, what our needs are, and what we can do to see our students perform.
Well, I appreciate the fact that the state scores are here, because I do think that that gives us a barometer as to how we are doing in regard to the state. But I was just wondering, so you feel like that dialogue was more in terms of the letter grades that are going to be issued, not so much that the test was so phenomenally different that we really couldn't make a comparison in the test. And I see your point about language arts, because it was a whole lot different than it has been in the past. Mathematics, not so much, maybe.
I think it's important to also underscore the fact that STAR, so first of all, the test did change a lot in the last year. It's fully online. A lot of items, instead of, like, let's take math, instead of multiple choice, it's open response where a student has to do the math and even at third grade and figure out what to put on a computer screen, which is a totally different interface. It's a lot for a third grader to have to figure out, or a fourth grader or a fifth grader. And STAR is one measure of many. The whole goal here is we want to see students learn at greater levels. And Wes brought up the fact that with our student demographics, 2 out of 5 students in Georgetown ISD grow up from what's labeled by the state as disadvantaged circumstances. So we want to have multiple measures of learning and see that student learning is improving, and STAR is one of those measures.
Right.
I think what's interesting too, to Dr. Paddle's point, for sure they had been saying apples and oranges when it comes to the accountability system, but they're grading kids on whether they moved from approaches and stated approaches or approaches to needs. So they're, on an individual kid basis, they're saying last year's test is comparable to this year's test now. They had to do a whole lot of psychometric analysis to say, okay, we feel good that they're just as hard, this one versus this one, but what you can see is it took a different level of mastery of certain questions to hit meets and masters, even if we say the overall test was about the same difficulty. And I would still be curious to see as we look through, because even at the beginning of the year when the commissioner was talking to us, like, no, we swear it's going to be just as hard. We took just as many big circles and little circles that represent big, hard questions versus little ones. Well, if you get that extended constructed response question early, and you look at that and you just, like, I have no idea how I'm going to answer that. We're human beings. It's gonna impact the next couple questions after that. You don't experience a question in isolation. So I think we're seeing that there is impact of the difficulty on, for sure, how to get into those higher categories of needs and masters. If you aren't answering those extended response questions correctly, you're not falling into the master's category. So there's for sure some differences there, but the state is comparing last year to this year, and that's where in accountability we'll see growth issues or not in that stance.
We should move forward.
Yeah.
Can I have
Yeah.
one more question? In the olden days, there was, I think it was Leap Forward, that would take the kids, how they did like in third grade on the math objectives themselves, and you could forward it into the next year's classroom so that the next year the fourth grade teacher would have their new class would have which of kids did well on which objectives, and so it gave you a place to start. Do we have that computer program, and are we using this computer program? Because I would assume that the teachers should have if we have it and we're using it, then they have that information in their classroom to use.
Yes.
Yep.
We have both the information, like we utilize Leap Forward, and it's in Eduphoria, Leap programs that run those reports. More importantly, I think we use our DOI assessment data, because as much as it is helpful to have the information on how they did the previous spring, we also then get DOI data, whether it's through MAP or through M-Class, that for that particular student too, that's aligned to the standards for that grade level and not the grade level for previous. So,
Okay.
I have a quick comment before.
Yeah.
Quickly, with the national focus being on math and literacy, before we move on away from math and reading, I think it's noteworthy that as you look at the STAR grades 6 through 8 in reading and in math, not only have we improved over the year from overall student perspective, but if you look at what you guys teased out for us, thankfully, if you look across all the demographic profile, if I'm interpreting this correctly, our approaches and meets has improved with each individual group, which I think is incredible. There's not one particular area that we've taken a step back. I think that's noteworthy and commendable.
Yeah, and it's been a ton of work, particularly in our emergent bilingual department and our special education department on really working with our Tier 1 instruction to make sure that those students are receiving on grade level Tier 1 instruction for the standards that they have for that grade level.
That's great. There's not one group carrying the load for everyone.
Yeah.
Every single group is making improvements. So that's awesome.
Alrighty, so we've had this up on the screen for a little while. I trust we've taken a little bit of a look at that, but this is STAR grades 5 and 8 science for the record. That's the two grades that science is assessed until you get into biology in high school. Following similar trends that we've discussed. We'll tease out and look real quickly. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. Look there. And then shifting gears, looking at social studies.
So what we're seeing in science and social studies is, and again, these were rework tests as well, but these are really largely literacy tests as well that are testing science and social studies content. So we did see a decrease in the passing rate for both GISD and the state in 5th grade science. In 8th grade science, we spent a good amount of time training our teachers on the new item types, and so when we analyzed the student responses versus the new item types, most of those actually performed pretty well. There was one type that required students to drag and drop questions onto a chart that it seemed our students seemed to struggle with. But we're not sure whether it was the new item type or the fact that what that was testing was actually a 7th grade standard on the 8th grade test, and so we need to tease out whether it was a question type issue or that we need to go back and make sure we're filling in gaps from previous years in science instruction. 8th grade social studies, we also saw a decrease in passing rate for GISD. Social studies didn't have extended constructed response, but they now had short constructed response questions. So again, these are not essays, but they had to write and defend their stance from information from the text in order to get full points in there. And so we know that we need to add some authentic instruction around how to do those short constructed responses as well. We were also putting an emphasis on, like I said, making sure that there's literacy happening in both science and social studies, and that when we're doing it in ELAR, we're using passages that might bolster our understanding of science and social studies concepts. And then I also do want to draw attention to this is a K-12 science adoption year. So we haven't adopted new resources for science since 2014, I believe. I was actually just out of the classroom then. So we will be going through an entire K-12 science adoption, so we'll be looking at resources that are really good quality to align to the standards and to the instructional frameworks that we need. So just to kind of review what Wes talked about at the very beginning, you all saw the SIPs and DIPs that we presented earlier, and so prior to even having this information, we knew that multi-tiered system of support was an area of emphasis that we needed to work on in the district, and that's academic, that's behavioral. We're really trying to intervene on the right stuff for each individual kid and what they need. So our campuses are working on intervention strategies, and one of those is identifying the real essential standards that we say, you gotta know this, like you can't just get a 70 and move on, you gotta understand these essential standards. And so now we have another piece of information, which is this 3A data that we can use to select those throughout the year. Formative assessment strategies have been really key, and teachers working together to have common assessments that they can then discuss how students are doing. Our work in the priority engines, or the priority objectives. I do want to highlight, we have continuing professional learning on the curriculum documents. The teaching and learning team updated our leading learning document, which is our overview of how instruction happens in Georgetown ISD, and actually has fit in now the MTSS process with our instructional framework. So we did training on that in July, as well as curriculum work with our brand new teachers and our new GISD teachers. And then we're continuing our work on our instructional frameworks through labs and other trainings. And then the professional learning community support, most of what the teaching and learning team, as well as our learning design coaches and our members of our federal and special programs team and our emergent bilingual team, they go into teacher PLCs. And so the campus principals have been really great about coordinating with all of them and figuring out a schedule of somehow how to get everybody out so that they can be there at strategic times to work through content standards, unpack standards, and work on instruction with groups of teachers in their planning, in their PLC time.
Trustees, do you have any other questions for this team? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Sue Harrison to talk through our next item. Sue and Jennifer, we have a hard stop in about 22 minutes, so
I'm going to be fast and it's one slide. So here we go.
Not as interesting.
So we wanted to reach out to you guys today to talk about Senate Bill 763. This legislation was passed by the 88th Texas Legislature, and it allows public schools to employ or accept as volunteer chaplains. Public schools may choose to hire chaplains or accept faith leaders as volunteers to provide support, services, and programs for students. So one thing we want to bring to your attention is that each individual board member's vote must be recorded individually in our minutes per the statute. So normally when we say all those in favor and all those opposed, we will actually have to go around trustee by trustee and record your individual vote. But we have time. The statute requires a vote between September 1st of 2023 and March 1st of 2024. And when speaking with TASB about what options there are to consider, there are basically three things to consider. One is that we hire chaplains. Option 2 is to allow chaplains as volunteers. And option 3 is to reject any use of chaplains. So those are the three options that are available for our vote. But when we think about that, we would recommend to you that we continue to allow chaplains to voluntarily serve in support capacity in schools as that they currently do.
Does this law require any specific religion of chaplain?
No. I believe the original legislation perhaps came about because of perhaps in parts of the state, it was very hard to find counselors, and they were looking for creative ways and solutions about how to have that support in schools for students. Sure. Well, that's what I have today, so we'll have that on our agenda in the September meeting. Unless we hear otherwise, we'll let you guys discuss that and decide how to proceed.
And
Thank you.
Jennifer, I'm on Eastern Standard Time, so we actually have an hour and 20 minutes.
Why did you say that?
We need to get more sleep.
I promise I will not take an hour.
I'm on Eastern Time too.
Actually. Yeah, we're all on Eastern Time. So what we wanted to do, thank you, is just go over.
One the other way, I'm sorry. You shouldn't give me the number.
So we wanted to talk about the proposed tax rate for this coming year, and we won't talk about it for an hour and 20 minutes, I promise. This is something that we do each year. It's an annual process. We are guided by our truth in taxation legal requirements. We work very closely with Williamson County in order to get our truth in taxation calculations. In June, we talked about the tax rate as part of the budget because we're a July 1 fiscal year, so we do that as part of our budget. However, at that time, we didn't have our final property values. We only had the preliminaries. So now that we have our finals, and then we also have information from Texas Education Agency, now we're looking at what our actual rate will be. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And at the September board meeting, we will be bringing the rate for adoption. So this year hit a little differently because we had the legislative session, And property tax relief was a really big priority of the legislature, which was very good for taxpayers. A couple of highlights, the homestead exemption for taxpayers increased from 40,000 to 100,000, which is a substantial increase. And this is subject to voter approval in November. However, we're going forward as if this has been approved. That's been the guidance that we've been given from TEA. We do assume that this is going to be passed by the voters in November. The second big highlight is that the maximum compress rate, which is the rate we get every year from TEA, was decreased by 10 more cents. So that went down over 10 cents more than what it would have been. And then they also provided, because of this relief to the taxpayers, they provided us some hold harmless funds, both on the M&O side. So on the M&O side, we'll have less tax collections, but we'll also be sending less back in recapture to the state. And then on the INS side, we will be receiving funding that we would have lost for debt that's already been issued. Not for new debt, but for debt that's already been issued. So we will be receiving hold harmless funds from the state for both of those, for both the M&O and the INS side. So this shows the proposed tax rate comparison between years. Normally it would only be 2 columns. We went ahead and added a 3rd column in the middle just because there is such a large change from when we talked about this in June because of the legislative changes. So let's just look at the actual 2022 column versus the last column, which is the proposed for 2023. Our taxable values last year were $15.2 billion. This year, after the homestead exemption, we're looking at, and of course we had increases as well in property value, we're looking at $16.5 billion. That's in that last column in the top row. Had we not had the homestead exemption increase in that middle column, we would have been looking at $17.6 billion in property value. So we did lose about $1 billion of property value for the district. So then if you go down to the next row, we will talk about the M&O tax rate, which is 2 pieces. One is the maximum compressed rate, what we call MCR, and then our golden pennies, which we have 8 cents in golden pennies, plus the maximum compressed rate that the state gives us, which is $61.92. So our total M&O tax rate is 0.6992. If we go down one row to the INS tax rate, last year it was 0.3290. This year we're looking at 0.3475. This is calculated based on our debt requirements and also a proposed diffusion that we are planning for February of 2024. So that gives us a total tax rate for this year of $1.467, which does not exceed our no new revenue tax rate, which is a truth in taxation calculation that we are required to do. So our total tax rate reduction is going to be 16.69 cents this year for the total tax rate. So if we take that one step further, just to look at what that means for an average homeowner in Georgetown. Again, we have the 2 columns, last year 2022, this year 2023. Market value last year, an average home was $565,000. This year it's $516,000, so there was a decrease of $49,000. The next row down, the homestead exemption, as we talked about, it went from $40,000 to $100,000, so that's $60,000 increase in the exemption. The assessed value, which is the taxable value, went from $358,000 to $332,000, which is a decrease of $25,000. So if you go down to that bottom row for the estimated taxes for a Georgetown ISD homeowner, they will see an $866 decrease on their tax bill this year from last year. And then just to look at how that looks for the last 5 years, you can see that we were at $1.90 back in 1920. And now, if we go forward to this current year, we're looking at $1.467 proposed. And that's a 5-year decrease of 29.23 cents overall. So, any questions?
So this doesn't impact the actual, this really just impacts recapture, right? Not our actual, like, this doesn't affect the total amount we've already budgeted.
That's right.
But could it?
Well,
If we didn't reduce it so much, could we make up that deficit?
well, we are going to be running the numbers, so we will see. Because as you know, when we go through that summary of finance template, there's lots of moving parts. But if you think about the cup that we've talked about before, where it's filled up with property taxes and then the state and then the overflow is the recapture, really the state portion is going to be higher and our local property taxes is going to be lower and the recapture is going to be lower. So overall, it should be about the same on the M&O side, but there will be changes in the state funding portion versus our local revenue will be lower.
Yeah, that was a good question because since for lack of better words, since the cup is overflowing, then we're in a place, we're at the max local revenue anyway.
Yeah.
And so the state is making us whole through that compression. Question I had for you, Jennifer, is with the hold harmless for homestead exemption, how long is that hold harmless?
I think it's 5 years. I might need to check on that because there were some different timeframes, but I think it's 5 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know that was kind of a fuzzy number when it came out.
Right.
What do you think are the implications of a 5-year limit on hold harmless that we need to be thinking about as a school district?
So I think that our capacity, if we are not if we're not growing our capacity, then we will probably need to be looking at that because as the hold harmless gets phased out, we may or may not have something to fill that gap. We do have the legislative session, special session number 3 coming in October. May have some clarification on some things. I know we've been hopeful in the past and haven't really heard anything, but we do know the focus is on public education in October for the special session, and so they'll be addressing some of these questions.
I'm sure it'll be helpful.
Yes, I'm sure, as
Lots
always.
of clarity.
Now, I did a real rough and quick calculation that I just multiplied the tax rate times the appraised property value previously, and then the new tax rate by the new appraisal, and there's a difference of about $2.5 million. Is that the hold harmless
Yes, sir.
that we get? Okay.
It won't be quite as clear as that because of the recapture portion.
Yeah,
But
that's what it would
bottom
be if
line-
there was no recapture.
Bottom line. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we get to this, I did want to circle back to the accountability slide to make sure we covered this thoroughly and give the trustees any opportunities to ask questions that you have.
So, as we've talked and forewarned for quite a while, the system is changing or has changed. This is just some high-level bullets about what was changed about the system, specifically the scaling changes. And so, particular performance that was equated to a certain letter grade previously, those scales are now different, and they were all scaled down some. So, a CCMR rate to get an A requires much higher performance to get that same A in 2023. System methodology changes also, and Terry referenced this when talking about the growth. So comparing how did a student do in last year's test compared to how did they do this year's test, that was pretty significantly changed in the way in which they recognize growth. So low did not meet to high did not meet, or low approaches to high approaches. So they kind of created some additional strata in what does growth look like. As well as closing the gaps had pretty substantial changes. This is the domain 3 where we look at how the different student groups do. And the changes are mainly any student group that is more than 10 students is analyzed in this domain now. Previously, that minimum number was 25. So there's more student groups that are being examined than previously, as well as the targets. So previously there was kind of a binary target. Did a student group meet a target? Yes or no? Now there are long-term targets and interim targets and near-term targets for those student groups to work towards. The district calculation methodology is also different. Previously, we were treated as a district kind of like a big high school. We had CCMR, we had STAR, we had graduation rates. All of that ran through the normal, kind of the old calculation. Now, each school in the district carries a proportional weight based on their enrollment of tested grades. So obviously, our high schools are going to carry more weight in our calculation, but our middle schools will carry kind of proportional weight, so on and so forth. We've talked about the STAR test question type changes, but it bears repeating, as well as the writing being assessed on reading tests at each and every grade level. And these are, I know we went through them in pretty deep detail in April, but the new ratings, like Dr. Padaville mentioned, is really where Mr. Morath was pretty adamant about. We can't compare, 2023 ratings to 2022 ratings, though it will happen, I suspect. These ratings will come out on September 28th, is the date we're promised so far. And then just as we've seen and heard, per TEA, while performance may improve, ratings will likely decrease. And so just want to, I think it bears reiterating kind of those points that we know as we're going into kind of a new season of accountability. And offer any questions or dialogue. We'll go back and talk tax rates. Yeah. All right.
That's it?
That is it. Happy birthday, Ms. Black.